Hello for the 100th time. This ought to be something rather special, so let's look at two topics in one episode. Last time I said we'd look at the radiometric data's favourite source of dates, zircon crystals. The accepted story about the ancient Earth is that in its early stages it was a mass of hot lava which gradually cooled to form rock surfaces. It's called the Hadean era, after the mythical Greek hell. Everything was so hot that when the first rocks formed, they were changed by the heat into metamorphic rocks, which radiometric daters don't seem able to date. But they nevertheless convinced themselves that zircon crystals were unchanged by the hot conditions which metamorphosed those early rocks. So enclosures of all sorts of things, including radiometric isotopes, magnetized iron compounds, and remains of carbon from ancient life forms, were preserved intact. A very interesting paper about the fossilized magnetism in iron compounds in zircons was published by John Tarduno and his team of experts. It gives data from zircons in Australia and South Africa. Astoundingly similar data, showing that from their super reliable dates from 3.4 billion years ago to 3.9 billion years ago, there was no tectonic activity. This means that the crust had not yet broken up into tectonic plates, but there was indeed a crust, leading to so-called stagnant lid convection. This is a bit of a problem for the confident claims by evolutionists that life began in undersea hot springs called black smokers. These springs are part of the tectonic plate story. There's another well-known paper from a group of experts at UCLA. It also deals with the reliability of acclaimed zircon crystals. Elizabeth Bell and her team of experts tell us that some of their crystals are accurately dated to 4.1 billion years. They contain, among other surprising things, carbon, which is strongly indicated to come from a biological source. So life had been around for billions of years before the tectonic plates were broken up. It also turns out that the Earth was not as hot as Hades. There appear to have been crustal rocks and free water and at least primitive life forms. Like most technical papers in the scientific journals, neither Tarduno's paper nor Bell's paper are easy for non-specialists to read. Anyone wanting to know the nitty-gritty can refer to the papers I've mentioned. For the non-experts, I'd like to read what Rebecca Boyle wrote about what these papers say in understandable language. She's the author of a book on the moon and a science writer skilled in conveying technical papers in language understandable by everyone. Things were actually looking a lot more like the modern world in some respects early on. There was water, potentially some stable crust. It's not completely out of the question that there would have been a habitable world and life of some kind, said Elizabeth Bell, a geochemist at the University of California, Los Angeles. Taken together, the latest evidence from the ancient Earth and from the moon is painting a picture of a very different Hadean Earth, a stoutly solid, temperate, meteorite clear and watery world, an Eden from the very beginning. Well, that sounds to me pretty much like what the Bible says things were like at the end of Creation Week, just a few thousand years ago. Well, I promised we had two items to look at today, so let's go to the second one. Right from episode 1, I've been pointing out that real science, science which follows the scientific method, was a wonderful, exciting, and productive endeavour. But as Brian G. Wallace pointed out, in 1840, a group of Americans coined the word scientist and set up an organisation, ostensibly to transform their status and image and separate themselves as professionals from those they considered amateurs. Up to that time, science had been open to anyone. Newton, Brahe and Euler were mathematicians. Lavoisier was an aristocrat. Faraday was a completely unqualified bookbinder. Joule was a businessman. It had been no problem for them to follow Bacon's scientific method, solidly based on the premise that nature carries the stamp of the Creator, because they were all Christians. But the organisation those newly named scientists set up was secular and committed to materialism, in which no divine foot in the door could be allowed. By the middle of the last century, they'd established complete control of the profession of science. Now, as we saw in episode 96, Kelvin pointed out that if you study science deep enough and long enough, it will force you to believe in God. In the 1960s and 1970s, the establishment was forced to denigrate and turn away from the scientific method because following its dictates wiped out their pet theories of evolution and vast ages of time. Other scientists have also found, after long study, that science without the scientific method has been reduced to blind submission to materialistic paradigms. And as Thomas Kuhn pointed out, scientific research has become a strenuous and devoted attempt to force nature into the conceptual boxes supplied by professional education. In the channel chat, we have some outspoken atheists who ridicule such truths and claim that today's science is the real deal. It may come as a bit of a surprise to them to watch Sabine Hossenfelder's recent YouTube video, My Dream Died. Sabine Hossenfelder is a very well-known physicist and mathematician. She features in episodes 74, 75, 81 and 86. And you may remember, from episode 74, she also features in the Freedom from Religion Foundation. So I wonder how our scoffers, who never make coherent arguments and just say I talk nonsense because I'm a creationist, will take what a star from the Freedom from Religion Foundation says. She starts off by telling us what she expected science to be like. Her expectations were based on what real science was like in the days when it followed the scientific method. And what the scientific establishment succeeds in making outsiders, like our favourite atheists, think it still is.
When I started studying at the university, my expectations were based on biographies of scientists. They wrote a lot of letters to each other. They went to conferences. They were thinkers and tinkerers and had sometimes heated but usually respectful arguments. This is what I expected.
Then she tells us what she found when she had finished her master's degree and started research for a PhD at a physics institute in Germany. She started to find out exactly what science falsely so-called is really like.
The head of the institute made a lot of money selling textbooks. He wrote very little of these textbooks himself. Rather, he gave assignments for parts of the books to students and postdocs, which is why, in case you've ever wondered, these textbooks are so discontinuous and partly repetitive. It was also a rather rude awakening. It made me realize that this institute wasn't about knowledge discovery. It was about money making. And the more I saw of academia, the more I realized it wasn't just this particular institute and this particular professor. It was generally the case. The moment you put people into big institutions, the goal shifts from knowledge discovery to money making. Here's how this works. If a researcher gets a scholarship or research grant, then the institution gets part of that money. It's called the overhead. Technically, that's meant to pay for offices and equipment and administration, etc. But academic institutions then pay part of their staff from this overhead, so they need to keep that overhead coming. Small scholarships don't make much money, but research grants can be tens of millions of dollars, and the overhead can be anything between 15 and 50%. This is why research institutions exert loads of pressure on researchers to bring in grant money. And partly they do this by keeping the researchers on temporary contracts so that they need grants to get paid themselves, while the administrators who are paid on the overhead usually have permanent positions. But you get used to this kind of crap. And the overhead isn't even the real problem. The real problem is that the easiest way to grow in academia is to pay other people to produce papers on which you, as the grant holder, can put your name. That's how academia works. Grants pay students and postdocs to produce research papers for the grant holder, and those papers are what the supervisor then uses to apply for more grants. The result is a paper production machine in which students and postdocs are burned through to bring in money for the institution.
Carl Gauss said publish little but ripe. Today, it's publish or perish, even though it's utter tripe.
Most of that money comes from your taxes. After my PhD, I applied for another scholarship and got that, and then I got a postdoc job and a grant and another job and another job and another grant and so on. And I began to understand what you need to do to get a grant or get hired. You have to work on topics that are mainstream enough, but not too mainstream. You want them to be a little bit edgy, but not too edgy. No, it needs to be something that fits into the existing machinery.
That's what Thomas Kuhn was talking about. Research is a strenuous and determined attempt to force nature into the conceptual boxes supplied by professional education.
And since most grants are 3 years or 5 years at most, it also needs to be something that can be wrapped up quickly. The more I saw of this, the more I realized this wasn't how I wanted to spend my life. The other thing that happened was that the more I saw of the foundations of physics, the more I became convinced that most of the research there wasn't based on sound scientific principles. I know this sounds wild, like I'm the crank next door on YouTube, and maybe that's what I am. But I like to think that my argument was, and still is, very academic. I never intended it to be offensive. I just explained why thinking up new particles isn't a good strategy for progress in physics, and why that had gotten an entire discipline stuck. And naive as I was, I expected physicists to think about it. I expected rational debate. But that never came. No one was interested. No one is interested. They were interested in writing more papers. And that's what they need all these particles and other wild ideas for, to write papers, to get grants, to get postdocs, to write more papers, and round it goes.
And remember the string, and amplitude-hadrons, and loop quantum gravity, decorated permutations, and all the rest of the stories for producing thousands of worthless PhDs and hundreds of thousands of valueless papers.
At this point, I'd figured out what you need to put into a grant proposal to get the money, and that's what I did. I applied for grants on research projects because it was a way to make money, not because I thought it would leave an impact in the history of science. It's not that what I did was somehow wrong. It was, and still is, totally state of the art. I did what I said I'd do in the proposal. I did the calculation, I wrote the papers, I wrote my reports, and the reports were approved. Normal academic procedure. But I knew it was bullshit, just as most of the work in that area is currently bullshit, and just as most of academic research that your taxes pay for is almost certainly bullshit. The real problem I had, I think, is that I was bad at lying to myself. Of course, I tried to tell myself, and anyone who was willing to listen, that at least unofficially on the side I do the research that I thought was worth my time, but that I couldn't get money for because it was too far off the mainstream. But that research never got done because I had to do the other stuff that I actually got paid for.
And that's what I've been pointing out for 100 episodes. What a pleasant surprise to find an insider admitting it. Keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and press the bell so that you'll be notified as I release new movies. If you'd like to support this project, you're welcome to do so through Patreon. Find a link on my channel banner and in the description below.